Today was the day everything changed. I leaned against my car, arms crossed, watching as the first tow truck rumbled into the lot, followed by another and then another, their presence a clear declaration of war. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a call from an unknown number, but I already knew exactly who it was. Smirking, I declined the call and turned my attention back to the lot. Let them try to stop this. They had their chance. Now it was my turn. The drivers wasted no time. They got to work immediately, hooking up cars one after another, the sounds of chains clanking and hydraulic lifts humming through the air. The first SUV was hoisted up before its owner even realized what was happening. A man in a bathrobe and slippers came running out of the HOA neighborhood, his coffee sloshing over the edge of his mug as he waved his arms frantically. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, storming toward me like I was the criminal here. I didn't bother moving from my spot. "Clearing out trespassers," I said simply. "Your HOA had plenty of time to warn you. They chose not to. Not my problem." His face turned red as he spun toward the tow truck operator. "Put my car down. You can't do this." The driver barely glanced at him as he secured the last strap. "Talk to the property owner," he said, jerking a thumb in my direction before climbing into the truck and pulling away, leaving the man gaping in disbelief as his SUV disappeared down the street. The reaction was instant. As more people realized what was happening, the HOA neighborhood erupted in chaos. Residents poured into the lot, some still in pajamas, others dressed for work, all demanding answers as their cars were methodically towed one by one. A woman shrieked as she sprinted toward a tow truck, banging on the window as her car was lifted onto the flatbed. "You can't just take my car," she screamed. I pulled a stack of flyers from my pocket, the ones I had printed the night before with the towing company's contact information. Without a word, I handed one to her. "Your car isn't stolen. It's at the impound lot. Call the number, pay the fee, and you'll get it back." She snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're going to regret this." I laughed. Actually laughed. "No, I really won't." More tow trucks arrived, their drivers working like a well-oiled machine. By mid-morning, more than half the lot was cleared, leaving behind only the confused, angry residents who still hadn't grasped the reality of the situation. Some of them were on their phones, probably trying to call the police, their voices frantic as they exaggerated the situation in the hopes of making me look like the bad guy. I welcomed it. I had followed every legal step, documented every violation, and given more than enough warnings. There wasn't a single thing they could do to stop this. And right on cue, flashing red and blue lights appeared at the entrance of the lot, a police cruiser rolling up just as the last few cars were being hooked to the tow trucks. I turned to greet them as they stepped out, already prepared for this exact moment. "Sir, we got reports of unauthorized towing happening here," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. Before the HOA residents could try and twist the story, I pulled out my paperwork and handed it over. "Everything is authorized. This is my private property. I have photos, documentation, legal notices, and every single one of these cars was warned in advance. The HOA president was notified days ago and did nothing. I've covered my bases." The officer took his time reading through everything, his partner flipping through the photos I had taken. The crowd of HOA residents watched, some hopeful that I'd be arrested, others still yelling about how unfair this was. But when the officer finally looked up, he gave a nod. "Looks like you're in the clear," he said, handing me back my documents. Then he turned to the residents, his expression blank. "He's within his rights. If your car was towed, you'll need to contact the impound lot." The explosion of outrage was immediate. The residents couldn't believe it, yelling over each other, demanding to know how this was allowed to happen. One woman was practically sobbing, her mascara running down her face as she waved her phone in the officer's face. "But we live here. We were told we could park here. How is this legal?" The officer shrugged. Whoever told you that was wrong. This isn't HOA property. He owns the lot. I watched as realization started to sink in. The residents weren't just angry anymore. They were confused. Because now, the truth was unavoidable. Someone had lied to them. That's when she arrived. Miss Langston stormed into the lot, like she was walking into a battlefield. Her face red with barely contained fury. She zeroed in on me immediately, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she closed the distance between us. "Mr. Cruz, this is absolutely unacceptable," she snapped. "You had no right to do this." I crossed my arms, unbothered. I had every right. You ignored my warnings. This is on you. Her nostrils flared. The HOA will not stand for this. You've disrupted the entire community. You'll be facing serious consequences for this. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what exactly do you plan to do? Sue me? For enforcing my property rights? Good luck with that. She was fuming, but she had nothing. No counter. No argument. Just empty threats and an audience of furious residents who were now looking at her with something dangerously close to betrayal. They had trusted her, followed her authority, and now they were realizing she had led them straight into a disaster. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she turned to the crowd, lifting her hands in an attempt to salvage control. "Everyone, please remain calm. We'll sort this out." "Sort this out?" A man cut her off, stepping forward with a glare. "You told us this was fine, that we could park here, and now we have to pay to get our cars back." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone else shouted, "Are you going to cover the fees, then?" The air shifted. The anger that had been solely directed at me was now spreading, turning inward toward the very person who had started this mess in the first place. I could see it happening, the moment the power she thought she had began slipping through her fingers. And I smiled, because this was just the beginning. The fallout from the towing operation was nothing short of spectacular. By the time the last tow truck rolled away, the HOA residents were left standing in the lot, a mix of disbelief, fury, and sheer embarrassment written all over their faces. Some of them still clutched the flyers I had given them. Others had their phones pressed to their ears, no doubt calling the impound lot to figure out how much they'd have to pay to get their vehicles back. But the best part? The way the entire mess was no longer my problem. It had shifted, turning inward, and at the center of it all stood Miss Langston, now facing a growing wave of outrage from the very people she had deceived. I watched as residents surrounded her, voices rising, accusations being hurled with every passing second. "You said this was fine," a man snapped, waving his impound receipt in her face. "You told us it was handled." Another woman, arms crossed tightly over her chest, glared at her with barely contained anger. "Are you seriously going to pay for all this, Karen? Because I'm not wasting my money because of your stupidity." More voices joined in, the crowd growing restless, shifting like a storm on the verge of breaking. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, Miss Langston wasn't in control. Her confidence, that smug, dismissive attitude, was cracking. I leaned against my car, arms crossed, taking in the spectacle. It was almost too perfect. The very people who had blindly followed her, believing in her so-called authority, were now realizing she had led them straight into a disaster. I could see it on her face, the way she was trying to think of something, anything, to salvage her position. But there was no way out of this one. She had overstepped. She had ignored my warnings, and now she was reaping the consequences. I decided to push things just a little further. Stepping forward, I let my voice carry over the angry crowd. "Seems like your president didn't tell you everything," I said, loud enough that nearly everyone turned to look at me. I gestured to the freshly installed no parking signs still standing tall around the lot. "These went up days ago. Your HOA was notified. You had plenty of warnings, but instead of handling it, your dear leader here decided to pretend none of it mattered. And now, all of you are paying for it." That was the final nail in the coffin. If the crowd had been simmering before, Now they were outright boiling. "You knew about this," someone shouted at Miss Langston. "And you didn't say anything?" Another man shook his head in disgust. "All because you didn't want to admit you were wrong." The anger that had been aimed at me had officially been redirected. Miss Langston took a step back, face paling as she realized she had lost control. She opened her mouth, probably to come up with some excuse, some desperate attempt to shift the blame. But the crowd wasn't having it. The residents had turned on her completely, and it was clear there was no coming back from this. I watched as she stumbled through some weak defense about acting in the best interest of the community, but it was drowned out by the sheer number of people demanding answers, demanding compensation, demanding consequences. Deciding I had seen enough, I shook my head, giving Karen a nod before turning on my heel and heading back toward the warehouse. I had a business to run, and as satisfying as it was to see the HOA finally crash and burn, I wasn't about to waste another second on them. As I stepped inside, Karen was already waiting for me, arms crossed as she peeked out the window at the absolute circus unfolding outside. "Well," she said, her tone amused. "That went even better than I expected." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Told you. Give people enough rope and they'll hang themselves." She smirked. "So, what now? Think they'll actually try to fight this? Or is the HOA done for?" I considered it for a moment, then shrugged. "Doesn't matter. If they try anything else, I've got all the documentation to shut it down before it even starts." And just like that, life returned to normal. The lot was finally empty, free of the constant invasion of cars that had plagued it for weeks. Employees were able to park without hassle. Deliveries were back on track, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could focus on running my business without dealing with entitled HOA nonsense. But the story didn't quite end there. A few days later, a letter arrived at my office, an official notice from the HOA. I sighed, bracing myself for yet another empty threat, but as I read through it, my eyebrows lifted in surprise. It wasn't a threat at all. It was an apology, a formal, signed statement from the HOA board acknowledging that they had overstepped, that they had misled their residents, and that moving forward, they would ensure no such thing happened again. And at the bottom, a small but significant detail: Miss Langston had resigned. I sat back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. That was unexpected. I had assumed she'd fight tooth and nail to keep her position, to cling to the last shreds of authority she had left. But it seemed even she had realized there was no coming back from this. Her reign was over. I tossed the letter onto my desk, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction settle in. It had taken time, patience, and a whole lot of legal paperwork, but in the end, justice had won. And as I stepped outside that evening, looking out at the now peaceful, empty lot, I knew one thing for sure: no one was ever going to mess with my property again.